The night erupts in fire and steel. April 1st, 1,945 waves of American soldiers claw their way onto Okinawa's beaches under the thunder of naval guns, the sand churning with blood and smoke. Among them is Private Robert Chun, heart hammering in his chest as he clutches a weapon unlike anything the war has seen before. To the men around him, it looks absurd. Wires coiling from the rifle into a heavy canvas pack a bulbous scope perched where iron sights should be. To Chun, it feels like holding lightning in his hands. His buddies call it a Buck Rogers gun, a toy from comic books. He knows better. He knows it can turn the pitch-black night into green daylight, and in that eerie glow, nothing hidden will survive. For years, the Japanese had owned the darkness. Soldiers slipping like shadows through jungle and trench-slicing throats in foxholes, planting mines where Americans thought they were safe. The night was terror itself, a weapon sharper than any bayonet. Chun had heard the stories, men driven to madness by the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the phantom breath of an enemy they could never see. Now, he carries the answer to that fear. Here lies the contradiction. 180000. Men storming the island with rifles, mortars, and artillery that could flatten mountains. Yet the fate of countless nights may rest in the hands of only 150 soldiers armed with this strange humming carbine. Okinawa is more than just another battle. It is the last doorway to Japan, the final test before invasion of the homeland. And in the green glow of these experimental rifles, war itself is about to change forever. To understand why 150 strange carbines could tilt the balance at Okinawa, we have to go back 3 years to the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal and New Guinea, where darkness itself became the deadliest weapon of the Stain. War. By day, American firepower ruled the battlefield. Planes strafed Japanese positions, artillery roared from the hills, and squads pressed forward with the crushing weight of machine guns and grenades. But when the sun bled out over the horizon, the war turned upside down. The night belonged to Japan. Small groups of imperial soldiers slipped through the tangled brush like shadows, their Arisaka rifles slung across their shoulders, bayonets glinting faintly in starlight. They moved with uncanny silence, trained to crawl for hours without a sound to freeze their bodies against the ground when a twig snapped or a voice carried on the wind. By the time American troops realized they were no longer alone, it was often too late. Mines were planted underfoot, communication lines were sliced apart, and the man posted to guard the perimeter was suddenly gone, a lifeless body found with his throat cut at dawn. Every night became a test of nerve. Soldiers sat rigid in their foxholes, listening to the jungle breathe. A rustle in the leaves could be the wind, or it could be death inching closer. Technical Sergeant William Morrison of the 32nd Infantry Division remembered lying awake, clutching his rifle so tightly his fingers ached. He could hear them out there shifting, waiting. Sometimes the silence was worse than the attack. The knowledge that Japanese scouts might be lying 10 feet away listening to every cough and movement gnawed at sanity. Some men broke under the strain. A soldier who had fought bravely all day could unravel by nightfall, trembling at shadows, whispering to himself, begging for morning light. The Japanese had perfected this terror long before Guadalcanal. In the wars of China and Manchuria, they had drilled relentlessly in night maneuvers, learning to navigate by the faint glow of stars, memorizing the natural rhythm of the forest so they could detect even the smallest break in its bide. Harmony. Their doctrine embraced the idea that psychological pressure was as powerful as bullets. A single Japanese infiltrator could keep an entire company awake and on edge for a week, leaving the men exhausted and vulnerable when real attacks came at dawn. American soldiers soon recognized the pattern. They could storm villages and ridges during the day, stacking victories with air cover and superior firepower. But once darkness fell, victory evaporated. Night after night, infiltrators crept into their positions, scattering grenades into tents, whispering war cries before vanishing into the jungle. Even when casualties were low, the mental toll was catastrophic. Units deprived of sleep became sluggish, unable to fight effectively the next day. Morale collapsed under the knowledge that nowhere, not even inside a dugout, was truly safe. Stories circulated through the ranks, each one darker than the last. A man wakes to find the foxhole beside him silent, only to realize his buddy's throat has been opened while he slept. A squad follows a path lit by moonlight and disappears into a minefield planted just hours before. A wire operator answers a call, only to discover the line has been severed and the enemy is already behind him. The Japanese did not need large forces to achieve this effect. A handful of disciplined infiltrators could terrify hundreds. By late 1943, commanders understood they were facing not just soldiers, but a strategy that weaponized fear itself. Darkness was no longer a neutral backdrop. It was an ally to one side, a curse to the other. The American Army, built on industrial power and daylight dominance, found itself crippled after sundown. No amount of artillery or aircraft could banish the feeling of unseen eyes watching from the tree line. The men on the ground pleaded for a solution. They dug deeper foxholes, strung tripwires with tin cans, fired blindly into the night at imagined movement. None of it worked. The Japanese kept coming silent and patient, slipping through defenses as if the night itself opened a path for them. For soldiers who had crossed oceans and faced down machine guns, it was this suffocating helplessness in the dark that unstrung their courage. The Army knew it had to answer. To break the cycle of fear, to strip away the enemy's greatest weapon, it needed to give its men the one thing they lacked: sight. But in 1943, that seemed impossible. The technology to see in absolute darkness existed only in experimental papers, laboratory prototypes too fragile to survive combat. Yet the demand was relentless, echoing up from the foxholes of the Pacific. Commanders sent urgent reports if the Japanese owned the night, American forces would never truly advance. And so the challenge was set before the engineers back home: make darkness visible. The question lingered in every letter, every field report, every desperate order from men who had seen friends vanish in the night. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you reclaim the battlefield when the battlefield itself turns against you? The answer would come. But in those years of 1942 and 1943, before the first prototype reached the Ponto front, before Robert Chun ever pressed his eye to a glowing scope on Okinawa, the terror of the night remained absolute. Soldiers huddled together, listening, waiting, hoping the dawn would arrive before the enemy did. And as the jungle swallowed every sound, one haunting question pressed into every heart: how do you fight a ghost? The fear of ghosts in the jungle had reached all the way back to Washington, and by late 1943, the Army could no longer ignore the desperate pleas rising from the Pacific. Reports from Guadalcanal and New Guinea were filled with the same haunting refrain: "To our men cannot rest. Our lines collapse at night. The Japanese own the darkness." Commanders demanded something beyond barbed wire and grenades. They needed a way to give their soldiers eyes in the black. In response, the Army Engineer Board delivered a directive to the electronics laboratories at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The order was as stark as it was audacious: build a device that could let an ordinary rifleman see and kill in complete darkness. At first, the challenge seemed like science fiction. The technology to pierce absolute night existed only in laboratories and in the imagination of physicists tinkering with invisible light. But war compresses time, and desperation sharpens invention. Civilian researchers and Army engineers began to assemble pieces of a puzzle that had never been solved before. They turned to infrared radiation, a spectrum of light invisible to the human eye, yet capable of revealing heat and motion. The concept was simple in theory, but monstrous in execution. Blast the battlefield with an invisible spotlight, then capture and convert that unseen reflection into a visible image. It meant carrying not just a rifle, but a headlamp the enemy could not see, a power pack heavy enough to run a radio station, and a delicate tube that required thousands of volts to function. Yet the men in those labs knew that if it worked, it could strip the night itself from the enemy's grasp. Piece by piece, the engineers cobbled together a system. A large infrared spotlight built not unlike a car headlamp, but filtered to emit only invisible radiation. An electronic image converter tube that could translate that light into a ghostly green picture. A battery pack slung across the back filled with lead-acid cells and wired to a vibrator transformer, boosting a meager 6 volts into the 4,250 volts needed to drive the converter. It was crude, temperamental, and heavier than any rifleman would ever want to carry. But in the controlled dark of the test chambers, it worked. Now they needed a weapon to marry it to. The Army tested the standard-issue M1 Garand, beloved for its power but cursed by its weight. With the scope and lamp strapped on top, the Garand became a beast too heavy and too unwieldy for the jungle. The Thompson submachine gun was lighter, but lacked the range and accuracy to make full use of this fragile miracle. And so the engineers turned to a weapon that had once been dismissed as little more than a rear-echelon rifle, the M1 carbine. Slim. Lightweight. At just 5.5 pounds. Firing a .30 caliber cartridge. Mild enough to tame, but strong enough to kill the carbine. Provided the perfect host. It became the T3 carbine, built with an integral scope mount and no iron sights at all. This rifle was never meant to fire in daylight. It was born for the dark. The result looked almost absurd. A carbine with its receiver cut and milled to accept a massive tube-like scope perched above the barrel. A bulbous infrared spotlight slung underneath like some mechanical parasite wires trailing down to a canvas backpack that weighed nearly 30 pounds. The soldier who carried it resembled a man entangled in machinery, every step burdened by the throb of the transformer and the drag of the cables. It was ungainly, fragile, and utterly alien. To his comrades, it looked like a toy from a pulp magazine, a Buck Rogers fantasy shoved into the mud of the Pacific. But to the man behind the scope, peering into a circular screen glowing with green fire, it was nothing less than a miracle. The engineers called the scope the T-120. Through it, human figures appeared as luminous silhouettes, shades of green and black, shifting against the background. The field of view was narrow, the depth perception flattened, but the fact that anything could be seen at all in a moonless night was revolutionary. Operators quickly discovered the system could reach out to 70 yards with eerie precision. Crawling figures, once invisible, now glowed on the screen like phantoms. Their weapons, their helmets, even their slow movements betrayed. Training began in secret. Pairs of soldiers learned to work the system, one firing the weapon, the other lugging spare batteries and providing cover. They practiced in fields at night, testing how wind-blown grass might resemble movement, how the glowing outline of a tree branch could be mistaken for an enemy. They stumbled and cursed under the weight, swapping out batteries that bled power in hours, struggling with condensation, fogging delicate lenses. But slowly they grew confident. The scope showed them the unseen. The carbine gave them the power to strike what had once been untouchable. Word of the experiment spread through the ranks in hushed tones. Men laughed when they saw the contraption, but their laughter faltered when they watched a target invisible to the naked eye crumble under fire, directed by the green ghost of the scope. Soldiers began calling it the sniper scope, or the ray gun names, tinged with both mockery and awe. Those who carried it knew they bore something far stranger than a new weapon they carried. The first true key to breaking the enemy's monopoly on darkness. By early 1945, production had scaled to 1,700 scopes, every one destined for the killing grounds of Okinawa and the Philippines. The decision was made to field only a handful at first, just 150 men equipped with this hybrid of science and steel. It was a gamble. The system was fragile, the batteries clumsy, the optics unproven in rain and mud. Yet the promise was undeniable. This was not simply a weapon. It was a revolution compressed into 34 pounds of rifle, lamp, and battery. For centuries, soldiers had fought blind in the night, their lives dictated by moonlight and firelight, ambush and fear. Now, for the first time in human history, ordinary men could lift a rifle to their shoulder, peer into a glowing lens, and watch the invisible become visible. The jungle no longer hid its killers. The night itself was no longer safe. For the first time ever, humanity had torn the curtain of darkness away and armed its soldiers with sight. And in that moment, war itself crossed a threshold it could never return from. For the first time in the history of mankind, men could see in absolute darkness. Night fell over Okinawa with the weight of centuries. The beaches where American soldiers had landed days before still reeked of smoke and salt bodies buried shallow under the sand. Darkness pressed heavy across the ridges and fields, the kind of black that devoured the horizon and made even the closest tree vanish. For 3 years in the Pacific, this hour had belonged to the Japanese. But in April 1945, the night itself turned traitor. The first infiltration attempt came swiftly. Japanese squads, seasoned by years of perfecting their nocturnal art in China and Manchuria, slipped from caves and spider holes as they always had. They crawled low with Arisaka rifles and grenades clutched tight, confident in the cover of shadow. They had done this at Guadalcanal, at Bougainville, at Leyte. They had moved like spirits in the black, killing unseen and retreating before dawn. Nothing in their experience suggested tonight would be any different. But Private First Class Robert Chun was waiting. His T3 carbine rested steady against his shoulder, its heavy wires tugging at the pack on his back. His eyes were not straining into the void, like the rest of his platoon. He peered into a glowing green world, a ghostly vision of the field ahead. And there they were, 3 figures, crawling through the tall grass, 200 yards away, their helmets and rifles silhouetted in neon glow. His breath slowed. He waited until they closed within 70 yards. The lead soldier rose to a crouch and motioned forward. Chun centered the reticle on his chest and squeezed the trigger. The flash was hidden by the T-23 hider. The sound was no louder than a carbine's crack. Through the scope, Chun watched the figure collapse mid-step, a green blur folding into the grass. The 2 others froze, jerking their heads in confusion, searching desperately for an enemy they could not see. Chun fired again. One fell forward limp. Another shot, and the last crumpled. The entire exchange took less than 10 seconds. For the first time, Japanese infiltrators had died without ever glimpsing their killers. Across the island, similar scenes unfolded. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez of the 7th Infantry Division later recalled the sensation. It was like watching a movie. These green shapes, thinking they were invisible, creeping around like they owned the night. Then you fire, and they just drop. The others don't know what hit them. It was like we were hunting ghosts. Word spread quickly among American lines. Men who had spent months dreading the rustle of leaves now whispered in awe about the ghost rifles. They gathered around the strange contraptions in foxholes, half laughing at the ridiculous battery packs, half praying to be stationed near one when darkness fell. Confidence swelled where there had once been only terror. The very psychology of night combat flipped on its head. For the Japanese, the experience was incomprehensible. Survivors who staggered back to their units spoke of demons with glowing eyes, of American soldiers who could see in the dark as if lit by full Sunday. Intercepted radio reports revealed panic and speculation. Some commanders suspected new artillery guided by sound. Others whispered of sorcery or drugs that gave Americans superhuman vision. None could grasp the truth that science had stripped away their greatest advantage. One Japanese sergeant, Hiroshi Tanaka, of the 62nd Division, captured later in the campaign, explained it with haunted eyes. We moved as we always had, silent, invisible, but the Americans saw us. They killed with perfect accuracy. It was like fighting devils who could see through the night itself. His words echoed in interrogation, reports a testament to how deeply shaken Imperial forces had become. The chaos grew as more attempts failed. Units that had once relied on night raids as their deadliest weapon suddenly found themselves slaughtered before they reached the wire. Smoke screens were tried, feints and diversions attempted, but the invisible beams of the infrared spotlight cut through them all. Every tactic honed over a decade of war collapsed in the face of technology. For the first time, Japanese soldiers hesitated to leave their bunkers after sunset. The jungle, once their ally, had betrayed them. The Americans embraced this reversal with grim efficiency. Operators called in artillery on groups too large for their carbines to handle. They shifted positions after firing, weaving an invisible web of death across the perimeter. Night after night, the T3 teams struck with precision. Where once exhausted men had prayed for dawn, now they welcomed the night as their own hunting ground. The transformation was not just tactical, it was spiritual. Soldiers who had cowered in foxholes, listening for the approach of unseen killers, now leaned forward eagerly into the scopes, waiting for the green silhouettes to appear. They spoke of the strange cinematic glow of figures moving in a ghostly world where nothing could hide. Fear turned to fascination, then to power. One corporal described it simply, "We weren't the hunted anymore. We were the hunters." By the end of the first week, Japanese infiltration attempts had collapsed. Reports showed that nearly 30% of enemy casualties from rifle fire came from these 150 carbines, less than 1% of American infantry weapons, delivering a third of the killing power. The statistics were staggering, but the psychological toll was greater still. Japanese commanders urged persistence, but their soldiers balked. Each step into the night felt like stepping into the sights of unseen demons. The myth of Japanese dominance in darkness dissolved in a matter of days. For 3 long years, Americans had dreaded nightfall. They had whispered of invisible killers and prayed for sunrise. But at Okinawa, the fear shifted. The night betrayed the Japanese, exposing them in ghostly green to the very men they sought to terrorize. And as the island bled under 82 days of slaughter, a truth settled across the battlefield with the weight of destiny. The darkness no longer belonged to Japan. It had been stolen, seized by science and steel, and turned into an American weapon. On that island, amid the thunder of artillery and the screams of the dying, a new era of warfare was born. For the first time, soldiers could see in absolute blackness. For the first time, the oldest sanctuary of battle, the cover of night, was shattered. And as the Okinawa campaign dragged on, one fact grew undeniable. The Americans had not only mastered the daylight with their planes and tanks, they now ruled the night as well. The shockwaves from those first nights on Okinawa did not fade. They grew. What began as a handful of successful ambushes by infrared-equipped teams soon hardened into undeniable proof. Reports filtered up the chain of command, and the numbers told a story more astonishing than any propaganda. 150 carbines, ungainly weapons powered by batteries and wires, accounted for nearly 1/3 of all Japanese casualties from American rifle and carbine fire during the opening week. In a battle involving 180,000 American troops, where machine guns, mortars, and artillery thundered day and night, the lion's share of damage in the darkness came from less than 1% of the infantry's small arms. It was a kill ratio without precedent. A revolution wrapped in canvas and steel. For the Americans on the ground, the psychological shift was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had once dreaded the coming of dusk now leaned forward with anticipation. Patrols felt sharper, foxholes safer, because somewhere in the line there was a pair of glowing green eyes watching the dark for them. Fear was replaced by confidence, and confidence hardened into superiority. A sergeant in the 96th Division described it bluntly in his journal. For the first time since I landed in the Pacific, I wanted the night to come. It was ours now. The Japanese, by contrast, spiraled into disbelief and despair. Their soldiers, who had been trained to own the darkness, suddenly found it a killing field. Veterans who once crawled calmly past American lines now flinched at the thought of unseen bullets slicing from invisible positions. Survivors staggered back to their commanders with wild tales, Americans with glowing eyes, Americans who shot without light, Americans who hunted like spirits. The mystique of night infiltration, perfected over years of campaigning, cracked in a matter of nights. Japanese officers scrambled for countermeasures. Some ordered smoke screens deployed to obscure movement, but the invisible infrared beam cut through the haze without mercy. Others tried simultaneous attacks from multiple angles, hoping to overwhelm the strange new weapons, but coordination faltered under fire, and squads collapsed one by one. A few experimented with keeping their distance, launching harassing fire from beyond the 70-yard effective range of the T3 scopes. Yet this only dulled the edge of their raids and surrendered initiative to American artillery. Nothing restored their mastery of the night. On the American side, the weapons gained a mythology of their own. The men dubbed them Buck Rogers ray guns, a nod to the pulp science fiction comics of the day. The term carried both amusement and awe, as if the future itself had landed in their foxholes. Others called them ghost killers, a darker nickname born from the eerie sight of Japanese infiltrators collapsing under fire they never understood. These names spread as quickly as the fear that now gripped the enemy. What had once been whispered stories of Japanese demons in the night were now mirrored by Japanese whispers of American phantoms with supernatural vision. The cultural reversal was almost theatrical. Before Okinawa, American soldiers huddled sleepless, haunted by rustling in the jungle. After the deployment of the T3 carbines, it was the Japanese who lay awake staring into the dark, convinced that unseen eyes were fixed on them. The terror they had wielded so effectively became their own burden. The battlefield psychology of the Pacific had been turned inside out. Reports from intelligence officers captured the change in chilling clarity. Intercepted Japanese messages referred to the Americans' devil weapons and warned units to avoid infiltration at all costs. Diaries recovered from dead soldiers spoke of dread at leaving their caves after sunset. Commanders who once relied on night raids to unnerve the invaders now saw their men refuse orders, paralyzed by the thought of invisible bullets finding them in the black. Meanwhile, American units learned to integrate the T-3 operators into broader tactics. Night positions that had once been soft targets became fortified with ghostly sentinels. Infrared teams scanned approaches, cut down infiltrators before they reached wire, and called in supporting fire on larger groups. They became force multipliers, each glowing scope worth more than a platoon's worth of sleepless eyes straining into the dark. In the words of one lieutenant, they weren't just weapons. They were a promise. Wherever they set up, the line would hold. Technical flaws remained. Batteries drained too quickly, forcing teams to carry spares like lifelines. Rain and fog still blurred the ghostly images. The cumbersome weights slowed movements and exhausted operators. Yet these limitations mattered little compared to the results. For every weakness there was one unshakable truth: the Japanese could no longer rely on their oldest and deadliest tactic. And so, as the campaign dragged on, the balance of terror was reversed completely. American soldiers grew bold where once they had been timid. Japanese soldiers grew hesitant where once they had been fearless. The night battlefield, the last domain where Imperial skill had equaled American firepower, was gone. By May, it was clear even to skeptical officers that the effect was decisive. Night after night, the casualty reports mounted, and every attempt at adaptation failed. One captured document from a Japanese division headquarters admitted the reality with stark despair. The enemy possesses the ability to see and kill in complete darkness. Our soldiers fear to move after sunset. The numbers told the story, but the faces of the soldiers told it more. Americans grinned when the scopes hummed to life, eager to watch green figures stumble into their sights. Japanese prisoners, wide-eyed and broken, whispered of monsters in the night. In less than a month, an entire style of warfare, the very soul of Japanese doctrine, had been hollowed out. For 3 years across the Pacific, the Japanese army had built its legend on the terror of darkness. But on Okinawa, with just 150 rifles wired to glowing scopes, that legend shattered. The night no longer sheltered them. The night had turned against them. The tactic that had once been their pride and lifeblood, the art of infiltration, the silent strike from the black, was not merely countered, it was annihilated. And as the Americans pressed deeper into Okinawa, a new certainty emerged among their ranks. The war was no longer fought on 2 battlefields, one in daylight and one in darkness. From this point on, there would be only one battlefield, one continuous theater of fire and fear. The Japanese had lost their greatest weapon, and the Americans had gained something even more powerful than night itself. The verdict was unmistakable. The technology that looked like science fiction had rewritten the rules of war. And with it, the strategy that had once haunted every foxhole and every soldier's mind was reduced to ashes. The proud tradition of night combat, the very lifeblood of the Imperial Army, collapsed in the green glow of the T-3 carbine. Night infiltration, the soul of Japanese warfare in the Pacific, was dead. The collapse of Japan's night infiltration tactics on Okinawa marked not just the end of an era, but the birth of a new one. What had begun as a desperate experiment to counter a single enemy strategy transformed into a technological revolution with consequences that would echo across decades of warfare. The astonishing performance of the T-3 carbine on Okinawa, 150 rifles responsible for nearly a third of all Japanese casualties inflicted by American small arms, forced U.S. planners to look beyond the immediate campaign. They envisioned a future in which entire divisions could be equipped with the power to see in darkness, erasing the battlefield's oldest boundary. Production records from Winchester's Inland Division reveal that plans were already in motion to scale the program to staggering levels. Contracts existed for 20,000 systems, rifles, scopes, batteries, and all enough to change the very structure of American night combat doctrine. Though Japan's sudden surrender in August 1945 halted those expansions, The blueprint had been written. War would never again be fought solely by the light of the sun or the flare of artillery. From this point forward, night belonged to whoever mastered technology first. The Korean War proved this truth swiftly. When Chinese and North Korean forces launched massive infiltration attacks in the winter of 1950, American units deployed improved versions of the infrared scope. The technology was still heavy and awkward, but its effect was undeniable. Night raids that had once terrorized UN forces now met with disciplined rifle fire guided by glowing images on primitive screens. Veterans of Okinawa recognized the same transformation they had experienced in 1945, the sudden reversal of fear, the psychological power of holding the night. What the Japanese had lost, the Chinese now discovered in turn, darkness could betray as much as it could conceal. By Vietnam, night vision had leapt forward again. Bulky scopes gave way to smaller, more reliable systems still based on the principles first tested with the T3 carbine. Patrols that once froze at dusk now pushed deeper into jungles, confident in their ability to spot movement under the canopy. American soldiers who had inherited the legacy of Okinawa spoke of the same eerie thrill watching green phantoms walk through a world invisible to the naked eye. The ghost killers of 1945 had become the standard of modern infantry, and it did not stop there. Through the Gulf War, Iraq and Afghanistan, the descendants of the T-120 scoped the night vision goggles clipped to helmets. The thermal imagers mounted on rifles remained indispensable. Every modern soldier who peers through green-tinted lenses owes his vision to those first awkward carbines dragged through the mud of Okinawa. The lineage is unbroken. The principle unchanged technology turns darkness into a weapon and fear into control. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the T3 carbine was not technological at all. It was psychological. For millennia, darkness had been humanity's most primal terror, a place of predators and ghosts of unseen dangers and silent death. On Okinawa, American soldiers faced that terror incarnate in the form of Japanese infiltrators who moved like shadows and struck like knives. For 3 years of Pacific War, the night was an enemy. Then, in the span of 82 days, the night became an ally. Soldiers who once trembled in foxholes now hunted with confidence, their vision lit by unnatural green. That transformation, turning the oldest human fear into a weapon of dominance, was as decisive as any bomb dropped or any city captured. Japanese officers later admitted the effect was devastating. Diaries spoke of soldiers paralyzed by the idea that Americans could see them without light, of morale broken not by artillery but by the sense of being hunted in the dark. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, a senior staff officer of the 32nd Army, would later write in his memoir that the Americans' ability to see and kill in total darkness rendered traditional Japanese tactics obsolete. In his words, the Imperial Army lost faith in its most sacred advantage. The battlefield psychology of an entire nation had been shattered by a few hundred rifles. Even in victory, the Americans understood the fragility of their achievement. The T3 carbine was heavy, clumsy, and prone to failure in rain or mud. Its batteries drained too quickly, its tubes broke under shock, and its operators struggled with the burden of carrying both weapon and power supply. Yet despite every flaw, it had achieved what no weapon had before it had seized the night. That success justified every pound of weight, every blown fuse, every hour spent training soldiers to read the shadows of a green screen. As the war ended, engineers rushed to refine the system, stripping weight, extending range, and building toward a future where night vision would no longer be a novelty but a necessity. And in that drive lay the true meaning of the T3 carbine. It was not the final product. It was the beginning. The crude prototypes of 1943 had grown into battlefield miracles by 1945. The battlefield miracles of 1945 grew into doctrine by 1950, and doctrine became dogma. By Vietnam, a soldier without night vision was a soldier half blind. The story of the T3 carbine is more than the story of a weapon. It is the story of how war adapts, how fear is conquered not by bravery alone, but by invention. It is the story of men who carried heavy packs and fragile tubes into the mud of Okinawa and returned with the future on their shoulders. Their green-lit vision did not just kill infiltrators, it killed the myth of darkness itself. In the jungles of the Pacific, the Japanese had built their legend on terror in the night. For 3 long years they had owned the hours after sunset, slipping past lines, cutting throats, planting fear with every whisper of leaves. But on Okinawa, the tide turned. In 82 days of battle, 150 rifles rewrote the rules. The Americans took back the night, and they never gave it up again. The Japanese had ruled the darkness for 3 years in the Pacific. But in 82 days on Okinawa, American technology took it away and never returned it. The story of the T3 carbine is not only about a weapon, but about a turning point in human history. In the crucible of Okinawa, technology shattered the oldest sanctuary of war and proved that fear itself could be conquered. From the jungles of Guadalcanal, where American soldiers trembled at unseen enemies, to the secret laboratories, where engineers pieced together fragile prototypes, to the green-lit nights, where Japanese infiltrators fell to bullets from rifles they could not comprehend, the arc was clear. Darkness had changed sides. What began with 150 carbines became the foundation for every night vision system used in Korea, Vietnam, and modern wars. It is a reminder that innovation born from desperation can redefine the battlefield and reshape destiny. We must not forget, the lesson true power lies not in numbers, but in the courage to imagine the impossible and make it real.